Welcome to everybody that is present here in our room. But for those of you who are listening in to us, there are over 150 people on the phone right now listening to us. You don't have to worry about slides. We don't have any. What you're going to get is really expert opinions on 2013 issues as they affect our subject matter areas, and that is energy, the environment, and natural resources. Before we start and before I introduce our three speakers, just current events, a few on Environmental Law Institute. We just brought our team back from Mexico City, where they had been the last week doing judicial training for all of the federal judiciary of Mexico. We had a team of lawyers, but we also had a team of Mexican judges, including two members of their Supreme Court. Present in their audience were 150 judges and their staff, but on television, because they broadcasted across Mexico, were 681 people. And it was a wonderful tribute to their Judicial Institute for inviting us, and we're quite proud of that. You can go on our website, two recent publications, one last week, one just coming out today. Last week was at the confluence of the Clean Water Act and prior appropriation, which is the intersection of water quality and water quantity and how those could fit better together. But our lead lawyer, Adam Schempp, and then just today by Jim McElfish, citing wind energy facilities, what do local officials need to know on siting issues. But with that, let's turn to 2013 and what's on the horizon there. Many of you remember the famous quote by the president in 2008 in a White House meeting with Eric Cantor, who said famously, elections matter. And if we have any other theme, it is that for 2013 is elections do matter, people matter in that context, and we're going to be trying to give you our view of current events, and we really do have leading experts in each of those areas. I'm going to introduce them with just a few sentences of the people that are to my right and to the audience to their left, and then they will speak in the order that I am introducing them. When we're done, I will speak a bit, and then I will have a few questions for the group as a whole, but we'll start taking questions from the audience at that stage. All right, so starting off first is Sedin Kelly. She served 3 terms as a commissioner of FERC. She's a partner at Aiken Gump in the world of energy law. We're talking about one of the leading practitioners in the United States. Next to Sedin is Scott Fulton, who until fairly recently was the general counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency. He has a long and distinguished career at both EPA and the Department of Justice. There's really no major position other than maybe administrator at EPA that he did not hold. He was actually even acting deputy, but he served in their enforcement office. He was head of their international office. He was a judge on the Environmental Appeals Board before becoming general counsel and retiring from that position. On my immediate right is Bill Meadows. After a great history at both Vanderbilt University and Sierra Club, Bill became, and for decades, the president of the Wilderness Society, certainly our leading natural resource society in the United States, and as importantly, was the leader of the Green Group for a long period of time. Certainly over the last 2 administrations, probably no single individual has had the impact that Bill has had on natural resource development in the United States. So with that brief introduction, Sedin, take it away.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk today about the upcoming policies and regulatory agendas of the administration in the area of energy. And my focus is primarily on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, known as FERC, and developments under the Federal Power Act and the Natural Gas Act. And there are 6 of them that I'd like to highlight. Just to set the scene, the issues in the energy industry all revolve around natural gas prices. Natural gas prices and forward prices for gas are the lowest we've seen in 10 years. At the end of October of last year, if you looked at the Henry Hub price averaged for 2012, the price was $2.64 an MMBTU, very low. Indeed, 36% lower than the year before. Inflation-adjusted natural gas prices are the lowest we've seen since the early 1990s when we essentially deregulated gas. So what does it mean? It means that there's a big demand for gas and there's a big supply for gas. 6 issues that I want to touch on are LNG exports, gas-electric market coordination, cybersecurity for our critical energy infrastructure, compliance and enforcement in regulated energy markets manipulation, the build-out of infrastructure in shale gas production regions, and electric transmission planning and development. And I'm just going to highlight them for now to tell you what the issues are and where we stand going forward in 2013. LNG exports. There is interest, particularly among producers of natural gas, for exporting it in liquefied form. The Department of Energy is responsible for issuing export licenses. The standard that they follow is whether or not an export license is in the public interest. Interesting wrinkle in the law, if the export is to a free trade agreement country, the statute provides that it will be issued without modification or delay. Essentially, DOE has no discretion. The export license is issued. If it's a non-free trade agreement country, the question is it in the public interest? The test that DOE has used is for this public interest is whether there is a domestic need for this gas. There are now 15 pending requests at DOE for LNG export licenses to non-free trade agreement countries. DOE issued one, the 16th one, in May of 2011. It was very controversial. DOE conditionally authorized the Sabine Pass liquefaction export license, but conditionally. And DOE said, we've decided that we have a continuing duty to monitor the public interest. So we're not going to give you a free pass on this authorization. We're going to continue to monitor the demand supply of gas in the U.S. And if we determine that it's necessary, we might even revoke your authorization. DOE embarked on a study of the impact of exports on price and supply in the U.S. And at the end of December last year, the report from NERA was published. And that report has found that across all LNG export scenarios, the macroeconomic advantages of exporting outweigh the disadvantages. Interestingly, NERA also found that although exports will increase demand and raise gas prices, because the exports go into a world market, that'll tamp down the exports, and that gas prices, although they will only rise within a narrow band. DOE has put that study out for comment, and DOE has said that it will proceed to decide these applications on a case-by-case basis, one at a time, and that should start soon. How long it will take is unknown. FERC is responsible for approving the actual infrastructure, not the export license, but the infrastructure. Almost all of the companies that have applied for export licenses have applied to FERC for infrastructure approval. FERC's track record on approvals is about 100%. FERC generally approves them. FERC may modify them to take into account environmental impacts, but FERC generally approves them. This issue is politically sensitive because the new chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Senator Wyden from Oregon, was in the past a vocal critic of LNG ports on the western coast, particularly Oregon. And he is very cautious, has announced that he is very cautious about LNG exports. His first committee's hearing was on LNG. Gas electric supply coordination. The concern here is with the low cost of gas and the comparatively high cost of nuclear power and comparatively high cost and lack of desirability of coal-fired generation, that future electricity generation is going to be almost exclusively gas-fired. Hopefully some renewables, but for baseload generation, gas-fired. And the concern is as we become increasingly dependent on gas, not only for our heating supplies, but also for our electricity, what is the reliability going to be in the future? Those markets, the electricity market and the gas markets, developed separately, traditionally have different types of customers and different practices, and they don't coordinate seamlessly. And so is FERC going to regulate one or the other in an attempt to demand more coordination? I think the answer is yes. Cybersecurity. That's a concern not only at the administration, but in Congress. Both sides of the aisle are concerned about cybersecurity. They agree that something needs to be done. Not surprisingly, they disagree as to exactly what to be done about it. The president 2 weeks ago issued an executive order on cybersecurity, taking the lead in this political standoff, and has directed agencies, the Attorney General, the head of Homeland Security, and the director of the Intelligence Agency to do what I think is interesting, and that is to work more with industry to develop, to look at sensitive information about cybersecurity threats, to see if they can be declassified, or even if they are classified, nevertheless turned over to the industry, which has been demanding more information from the government, so as to enable the industry to respond inside the industry around these issues. Okay, thanks. In the electric industry, Congress in 2005 mandated reliability standards for the first time in our country's history. And some of those cybersecurity concerns will play themselves out in mandatory electricity reliability standards. Compliance and enforcement in regulated markets. I'm primarily focusing on the electric market and the gas market. In 2005, in the Energy Policy Act, Congress gave FERC authority for the first time over manipulation of the physical markets of electricity and gas. FERC was empowered to do everything necessary to prevent manipulation directly or indirectly. FERC has, in the last year and a half, focused on investment banks that have been involved in trading electricity derivatives and also trading in the physical market. And FERC has targeted them for activities that resulted in a loss in one market but benefited their position in another market. It's a bit controversial. There's also a dispute between FERC and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which also has jurisdiction over trading on the regulated exchanges. FERC has taken the position that it also has jurisdiction over those trading on those exchanges because that indirectly impacts the physical market. The CFTC disagrees. It's before the DC Circuit right now. Shale gas infrastructure. The fact that we've seen shale gas being developed in areas that are not traditional gas production areas, like, at least not recently, like Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, North Dakota, means that we need infrastructure if we're going to move that gas from the production area to the consumption area. That is all regulated by FERC. It comes with a lot of environmental concerns attached to it, and that will play out in 2013. Finally, electric transmission planning and development. FERC, about a year and a half ago, issued a new policy requiring the electric industry to plan transmission more regionally and interregionally, and the industry is right now filing its proposed compliance methods with FERC. And so we're likely to see a change in how we plan and permit transmission. The question is, are we going to need as much transmission as we thought we were when we were looking to build transmission for renewables now that natural gas prices have plummeted? Is that going to cut into our generation in renewables? So that's my highlight for now, and look forward to the question and answer part of our session.
Sudine, thank you very much. Scott Colton.
Thank you, John. Sudine. Greetings, everyone. Excuse me, I'm having a little trouble with my throat this morning. Nice to see familiar faces in the room. We have with us today Gerald Yamada, who is a former colleague, good friend from the Environmental Protection Agency, where he was the Deputy General Counsel. And see Carol Green over here, who was an Assistant Chief at the Justice Department when I started my career there, which was, I guess, about 10 years ago, right, Carol? To protect us both. I think in thinking about 2013 and what to expect from the Environmental Protection Agency and in the area within which the Environmental Protection Agency works, I think it's important first to think about the dichotomy between the first-term agenda and the second-term agenda, or likely second-term agenda for the Obama administration. This administration clearly saw as its primary objective at the beginning of its first term a rebuilding of the agency's core programs, which is really all about regulation. It's about command and control. It's about enforcement, sort of a strong return to the bread and butter work of the Environmental Protection Agency. And as you look back over that period, I think the actions of the agency and the efforts of the agency are reflective of that objective and sense of purpose. As we move into the second term, I think the Obama administration will see the objective of the first term as having largely been satisfied, that the core program has been rebuilt, and that energy will now turn in the direction of trying to envision and build towards the environmental protection program of the future. A program that I think will be significantly animated by the what will likely be the primary new policy interest and objective of the Obama administration in the second term, which is sustainability. And the notion of mainstreaming sustainability in the construction of this country's environmental protection programs. For starters, as we think about sustainability, a term which is sometimes wanting a bit in terms of precise definition, I think the agency will likely focus principally on energy efficiency measures as energy concerns emerge in all aspects of its programs, but also on materials management and new ways of thinking about materials management, new ways of thinking about waste as a deployable asset as opposed to something that is necessarily in a discard fate scenario. So I think the question of sustainability and how to make that idea work within the agency's programs will be a fairly central one, and I think it invites and will necessarily require creativity and innovation. It will also, I think, require a heightened degree of collaboration with the states as the primary implementers for a lot of this country's environmental programs, and also industry. I think there's a sense that these relationships need to be strengthened in any case, but I think there's a strong policy imperative that's going to enter the equation that will drive that interest in partnership with the private sector and states. I think this policy orientation promises to be dramatically reinforced by economic considerations. One being that, in my view, the primary legacy interest of the Obama administration, the president, is economic recovery. And I think the president, the White House, will be interested in an environmental protection program that enables economic growth and jobs development. Apart from that, we have the situation with the federal budget, and we appear to be on the brink of sequestration. This is a fairly dramatic thing to happen to the federal budget, and you all are students of these processes, but just to remind, it's indiscriminate in its application. Agencies and departments do not have the latitude to choose where to take these cuts. They operate at the program account level. So just for example, for programs like the enforcement program, which is heavily dependent on intramural resources, it's a personnel-driven enterprise where there are not contract dollars and grant dollars to look to as a place to cut funds. These impacts can be quite significant. And there's a lot of thinking about if sequestration comes, whether that's a short-term or a longer-term dynamic. I think most of the betting is it will be a short-term dynamic as the pain intensifies associated with those cuts. The urgency of finding a solution will also intensify. But with or without sequestration, the trend line for the federal budget, at least until we get the deficit under control, is a downward trend line. So we're dealing with an agency at the federal level that is looking at declining resources and having to think through how to get its mission done in a more efficient way. And we also have compression at the state level that's inescapable. I mean, the states will feel some of the pain associated with sequestration. And although most states are not heavily reliant on federal funding to run environmental programs at this point, wow, that's going quickly, they will still feel that impact, and they have their own constriction at the state level. So all of this, I think, is going to push strongly in the direction of trying to find more efficient, smarter ways of getting the work of the agency done. Let me just offer a few examples of how that might become manifest. I think there will be an interest in looking for situations where state and local governments can be entrusted to successfully implement environmental programs without the same degree of oversight that might have been present in the past. I think the interest in electronic reporting and how we sort of harness technology to make this business, this process of environmental protection more manageable for everybody involved is going to be an important initiative going forward, or will continue to be an important initiative. I think it's interesting to think about what advances in monitoring technology might mean for the future of environmental protection. For example, the possibility of monitoring for compliance at the fence line as opposed to at every emission source within a facility. I think third-party certification or compliance monitoring regimes are also very ripe for discussion right now, and I think there will be openness to thinking about how those can complement the work of government. I think creating the space for more self-governance by strong performing folks in the private sector seems like a likely point of focus. So I think these are just a few places where this interest in efficiency and more sustainable approaches will likely become manifest. And there are other things on the regulatory side, but I imagine some of those will come up in the Q&A, so I'll stop there.
Scott, thank you very much. Now we turn to Bill Meadows. Bill?
John, thanks, and thanks for the earlier very gracious and exaggerated introduction. I'll speak to conservation opportunities in 2013 and a little bit beyond, I think, in the second term. In my opinion, the top three areas of focus will be energy, administrative designations, and climate, and as it relates to land conservation, adaptation, mitigation related issues, mostly around water and fire for public land. Let me just offer a few points of context for what we're thinking about here. I think except for the omnibus legislation of 2009, which was actually coming out of the prior Congress, there's very, very little permanent protection of land that has occurred in the first term. In fact, this past Congress, the House, very difficult place to work. Because of the difficulty, this is the first Congress in 70 years, since 1963, that there was no permanent protection of land coming out of the congressional actions. The administration had modest, probably put their toe in the water a little bit with a couple of new wildlife refuges and 5 monuments, and actually changed the name of a monument to a park. But it's very modest conservation activity in the last term. Politics are tough. Funding is probably even more difficult, and I don't think we can be optimistic that either are going to improve. Certainly in 2013, 14, or even in the last 2 years of the second term. As a result of the congressional difficulties, principally coming through the House of Representatives, I think any land conservation measures that lead to good conservation outcomes will come from the administration. And I think there's a common wisdom that the White House doesn't care about conservation. I challenge that. In fact, I worked in conjunction with the Obama campaign trying to challenge that assumption and get my conservation colleagues to be engaged more. And in fact, we created a group of conservationists for Obama, created a list of the top 10 reasons that President Obama is the great outdoors, is America's great outdoors president. And there are lots of examples of great things that happened in the first term, and I think that sets the stage for 2013 and the second stage. I think that the White House has had a little bit more on their agenda than land conservation, so it's not surprising that the perception is that they don't care. However, I think it is the conservation community's responsibility to build the political case and actually provide the support for that agenda, and that's what I think has actually began to emerge in the election, and I think will be prevalent in 2013. I think the agencies, in opposition to the White House itself, the agencies really do care. In my work with the Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture have many examples that we can talk about would demonstrate that active participation in actual outcomes. Interior's in transition. We don't know exactly how that will play out. Sally Jewell has been nominated as the Next secretary confirmation is next week on the 7th of March. She has a good background, an interesting background, I think, for the position. Resume is very, very strong. I know her personally, don't know her well. She's certainly a strong advocate for the role that conservation and public lands play in economics of the West. Her recreation interests are, I think, guide her in understanding what public land protection and recreation participation mean for local economies. She's also a huge supporter of America's Great Outdoors initiative that was principally Ken Salazar's initiative, but was embraced by the Obama administration and became a framework for thinking about conservation for the 21st century. It seems to me that what has happened in the last 4 years is important to set the stage for the next 4 and for this coming year. There really has been a paradigm shift regarding the definition of multiple use and the way in which that is guided. It's played out in timber management, restoration, forestry restoration, sustainability, oil and gas leasing, and particularly in solar with the programmatic environmental impact study. I think there have been, out of the last 4 years, have been significant policies, secretarial orders, guidance. For example, the new forest planning process, the establishment of landscape conservation collaboratives, the work that's gone on in the National Landscape Conservation System, actually defining that as a conservation unit within the BLM and actually giving it some power. Within the BLM, the establishment of rapid eco-regional assessments that have helped in the planning processes. I think there has been within all the agencies real consideration of science, which didn't exist in the prior administration from my perspective. One could not speak about climate change before 2009. And so now the planning processes within all of the agencies include consideration of climate and the adaptation needs. I think the America's Great Outdoors initiative, while not very specific, gave a framework for programmatic development that is taking place even now. Focus on large landscapes, looking at local engagement of communities and a broad base of participants and stakeholders. Focus on urban areas, on rivers, for example. So what does that lead us to for 2013? I don't think we'll have any help from Congress. And so I think we have to think about the policy and practice application coming mostly from the administration and administration actions. I do think that we'll see more outcomes, more positive outcomes in conservation, coming from the fact that we've gone through some pretty solid planning and policy establishment in the first term. So we're now at a phase where we can actually implement some of those policies. So you move from policy to practice, and in 4 years, it is my view that you'll actually move to a place where those policies and practices will be institutionalized. They're not institutionalized today. Elections do matter. And in fact, if you didn't have a second term, I don't think many of the policies that were advanced in the first term would actually take place. I do think that we'll expand some of the policy. There'll be an overlay of policies. For example, the work that's been done on solar will be extended to wind and geothermal. I think there's going to be a major focus on mitigation, looking first at how to avoid, then minimize, but then use mitigation as a way in which you address restoration and some conservation funding. I think there is an opportunity. I think there are 3 areas that I would say where there'll be a strong focus that we can look to in 2013 to show some results. So in my view, those are in the area of large landscape conservation. I think the planning exercises around large landscapes involving multiple stakeholders getting to better results. If you look at the way in which We're doing solar zones, for example, where you're planning energy development concurrently with conservation so that you do smart from the start approach to energy development. There is, I think, an opportunity available in the area of conservation funding. Also coming out of this planning for energy development, there's going to be a much greater emphasis on trying to use resources from energy development to go back into the conservation programs, sort of an expansion of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That will require congressional action, so it's a little more difficult, but I think there will be a major emphasis on the conservation funding. So the things that I would highlight, the opportunities for land conservation are going to exist in the administration through the creation of refuges, the naming of new national monuments, the utilization of the Antiquities Act. I think that's a real opportunity. I think in the energy field, the nexus between energy development and conservation together, doing that work concurrently. And then thirdly, the opportunities that come from increased funding that may come from energy development itself. So we can get into those later.
Bill, thank you very much. I'll be clean up, and then we'll start taking questions. All right, I already told you thematically elections have consequences. Then I'm going to tell you that people matter, money matters, and then I'm going to talk a little about courts. As Scott started us out, come on, this is the week of the fiscal cliff. I mean, you can't open up a paper in the nation without having the consequences of us falling off the cliff, and that has impact on environment, energy, and natural resources issues without question. And as we know, this is the first of a series of economic dominoes, which are all difficult. The federal government is operating under a continuing resolution right now. That expires. They need a budget for the rest of the year. The president has yet to submit the budget for 2014. He is late submitting that. And of course, in pretty much most of our lifetime, Congress has not actually come up with a budget by the end of the fiscal year. And so we have all of those uncertainties, which makes it difficult in our area of environment, energy, and natural resources for there to be good planning. If somebody's worrying about whether or not they're going to have every fifth day a mandatory furlough, it's a little hard to get your hands around the next regulation that needs to come out. And so money matters. When I was in the federal government, by the way, I used to say to all the people who would come in and say, well, with you now in this administration, we're going to be doing more with less. And I kept saying, no, actually, we do less with less. So first of all is money matters. Second is people matter. At the beginning of the first term of the Obama administration, there was one unifying issue among virtually every cabinet level person. Secretary Chu, clearly, Jane Lubchenco, who was here last week speaking at NOAA, Ray LaHood at Transportation, certainly Lisa Jackson, certainly Ken Salazar. There was one uniting thesis for them. It was climate change. Every single one of them were outspoken in that area. Every single one of them were promoting it within their own department, there within the authority that they have. The president now, in the State of the Union, identified two issues, right? Energy and climate. But now we got to see. We have to see, where does Sally Jewell come out on climate issues inside of public lands in the United States? If the papers are correct, although she has not been nominated, if Gina McCarthy gets nominated as EPA administrator, then we have a very strong person on climate issues, and it'll be an interesting confirmation, won't it? Just because of that particular issue. But anyway, clearly, people matter. And now just let me do court things for a minute. And that is right this moment in New Orleans is probably the biggest environmental trial in most of our lifetime. 12 weeks planned, hundreds of, you don't need hundreds of witnesses, hundreds of lawyers descending on the courtroom of New Orleans, looking at the impact of the deaths and the sinking of Deepwater Horizon and the multi-billion-dollar impact that had on the economy, and on the environment and ecology of the 5 Gulf states where the oil affected them. And that was a defining moment for the administration in the first term. And now we're going to see what happens on the second term. It impacts it in numerous ways. First of all, because of the change in law that now allows whatever penalties are adjudged, a substantial part of those to go to the cleanup of the Gulf. And that's significant. In our lifetime, we may well see important things happening in the Gulf, and they'll come out of tragedy. The tragedy was, in fact, a Deepwater Horizon. For those of you who are trial lawyers, this is, in fact, a dream come true, watching all these great lawyers arguing about environment issues. And so you should be tracking it, you should be following it. That's what's happening. And those things will actually occur this year. We don't know. By the way, the trial does not cover natural resource damages, which, as you know, is that whole concept out of the Oil Pollution Act that would raise the Gulf back to where it would have been but for the polluting event. But it's sort of hard to see that a settlement would not include natural resource damages. And so, again, that's quite important. The Supreme Court, we used to think, was going to stay away from environmental cases. Too hard. You have to read federal registers, and you have to do all those sorts of things. But boy, that's not true now, is it? Now, every term, you can see cases that either directly involve the environment, as we saw in the stormwater cases, which I'll mention in a second, or indirectly involve the environment in the takings cases. And then there's 2 that you might not have heard of, which I'll just mention in passing. All right, so what happened? The stormwater cases. Stormwater are a huge issue right now in the environment, without question. As we clean up the Chesapeake or we clean up other river bodies, stormwater that comes in out of roads and things, as does agricultural waste and things, is a very, very important issue. 2 cases before the Supreme Court. However, particularly of those of you who are watching the Ninth Circuit, if I just tell you, here's a series of events. A citizen group brought an environmental case. The district court ruled against the citizen suit, and the Ninth Circuit reversed. That's all the facts I tell you. And then I ask you, how is the Supreme Court going to rule? You could probably get it right 100% of the time. As I've told others, I'm still convinced that in the Supreme Court somewhere there's a box that says Ninth Circuit. And there's a skull and crossbones or something over the top of that. Because we had the arguments in the 2 stormwater cases, one out of Los Angeles, one on the Pacific Northwest, have already been heard. I was at both arguments, and in both cases, the real issue was, do we vacate the Ninth Circuit decision, or do we remand the Ninth Circuit decision, which gives you some idea of what's happened. In the one that covers logging in the Pacific Northwest is more complicated. Oral argument was on Monday. EPA came out with a final rule on Friday that clearly irritated the chief judge, and he has now asked for further briefing as to whether or not the EPA rule even just moots the case out, and that's not decided. There. But anyway, those 2. There have been now takings cases. This is the Fifth Amendment concept that, of course, the United States can take land but has to pay just compensation. And there's a whole body of law that has come out of that. And at regular intervals now, we're seeing more cases in that regard. This term, there have already been one that's decided, one that's argued. The one that has been decided is the Arkansas case that dealt with temporary flooding. And the question was, could temporary flooding ever be a taking under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution? Now, I will assure you, those people who had their land flooded thought so. They kind of thought that was a taking during that time period, and so did a unanimous Supreme Court, written by Justice Ginsburg, saying the rule of law is not that it can never be a taking, it can be a taking in some cases. So that's been decided. The second one has just been argued. We don't have a decision yet. It's an issue that many of us have talked about all along, and that is, what if you condition a permit? You condition a permit. Here you're conditioning a wetland permit on mitigation. The other party says, no, I'm not going to do that mitigation. Could that be a taking? there. By the way, I was not at oral argument, but we had people at ELI argument that were at oral argument. Consensus was landowner probably loses, just out of what they heard in the oral argument case, but that was out there. Two ones that are relatively recent, just, think about it in the context of what is important environmentally in the next 2 years. One of the things that's important is water quantity issues. I keep telling people when I'm on the East Coast, I talk about water quality. When I'm on the West Coast, I talk about water quantity there. And in some cases, they actually intersect, but we have 2 cases now before the Supreme Court pretty much dealing with water quantity and their states. As most of you know, if a state sues another state, that's one of those rare issues where the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. You actually don't have to go through the appellate process. You can actually launch that, and we have one. And it's really, it's the Rio Grande Compact. So it's Texas and New Mexico, Colorado in a fight. And then there's one set for argument on April 24th, and that's Red River, and that's really Oklahoma and Texas. And so you don't see as much, but they are actually quite important because it's actually indicating the water quantity issues, and if there's ever a way out for us of these horrible water fights that we've gone in through for most of this century, the compacts are actually an answer, but there is litigation coming out of that. All right, so what about Supreme Court term coming up, where we really don't have any cases yet? But I will predict one for sure, I think, that there will be a petition on, and second one that there could be, and they're both actually significant, and you can ask us in questions. The very first one, which I'm 100% sure there will be a petition to the Supreme Court, and that is on the EPA's greenhouse gas rules. As most of you know, EPA came out with 3 rules that got combined, dealing with vehicle issues, dealing with the so-called endangerment finding by EPA, and then dealing essentially with the beginning of regulating stationary sources. Those were the 3 rules. They get argued together in really historic argument, 2 days before the D.C. Circuit. And then in a per curiam decision, meaning that the 3 justices of the court, Santel, Rogers, and Tatel, a pretty strong panel, by the way, did it together without any one of them indicating, which part of the opinion that they wrote. A very strong opinion upholding everything for EPA. Predictably, there was an en banc sought. En banc was denied with 2 dissents. One of the dissents was actually quite strong, quite good, a dissent, very thoughtful. So that's why I would absolutely predict that case, there is a petition to the Supreme Court. I'm not yet predicting whether or not they would take it. There's a second one, and this is a loss for EPA, not an insignificant loss. The cross-state air pollution rule, universally known as CASPER, not the friendly ghost. This is air issues downwind. It's hard enough for a state to control the pollutants that it does itself, but what about your neighbors? What about controlling what they give? And EPA has been trying now for years to impact that under the prior law, Clean Air Interstate Rule. D.C. Circuit set that aside. This is another try. They set that aside. En banc was sought. En banc was denied. So it could be a case that, in fact, there could be a petition to the Supreme Court. Just one aside on that, by the way. This is strange procedure. Because the D.C. Circuit invalidates, meaning they find it illegal, the cross-state air pollution rule. And what do they leave in effect? That now is still controlling all of the emissions. They leave in effect the Clean Air Interstate Rule that another panel had before found illegal. It's just an interesting aside for D.C. Circuit. I have no prediction on XL Pipeline. Zero prediction, except I would again say people matter. The person that has now become confirmed as Secretary of State, John Kerry, is one of the leading proponents of climate change issues in the Senate, and that's an issue. That's an absolute issue, of course, is the greenhouse gas effect. There's other issues on XL Pipeline besides greenhouse gas, but this is an issue that the State Department decides, which is rather unusual, but it's cross-border doing that. So that's going to actually happen and come up. Okay, there's lots of other things that will happen, but I want to leave time so that we have questions available, but I'm going to start out. So let me, this is for all three of you. So what about natural gas hydraulic fracturing? Sudin, I'll start out with you. Is this the savior? It's cheap? It's half the emissions of greenhouse gas? Or is this just the devil in hiding right now because it's going to drive out other forms of energy experiment because it's so cheap? And also it does have environmental consequences. Where do you stand on this?
Well, it's both of the above. It is indeed a savior if you look at economic development. As Scott mentioned, one of the priorities of the administration is economic development and jobs development. It's a savior for rural areas that have not traditionally seen economic development, for landowners who have, by and large, not been well off. It has national security implications. It's enabling more domestic oil production, which in turn is decreasing reliance on imports. And it's good for consumers, lowering energy consumers, lowering their costs. It's good for American chemical industry, lowering feedstock costs. And then there's the other side. And you yourself mentioned water quantity issues and water quality issues. And I guess I would say that the biggest environmental impact, there are lots of environmental impacts that are discussed around hydraulic fracturing. But I think the most significant one is water quantity. It uses a lot of water. And water quality, and how do you dispose of it? And it's another interesting fact, I think, at least as an observer, I'll be interested to see what other people think, is that it's happening in areas that haven't seen gas or oil production, at least not since maybe the turn of the century. And they have do not have an established state regulatory framework. So you're looking at production and activity, development activity taking place on a clean slate for environmental regulation. And Senator Wyden is looking at the possibility of federal regulation, but given our divided Senate and House, I wouldn't hold out a whole lot of hope that we would see that.
Who's going to be Secretary of Energy, by the way?
Good question. We don't know yet.
The MIT guy is in the newspaper.
Dr. Moniz, Ernest Moniz, is at MIT, was undersecretary in the Clinton administration, and a good candidate.
Scott, hydraulic fracturing, what's going on?
My sense is that because of the additional natural gas capacity that's promised by this technology, it's inevitably a part of our energy future. I think natural gas itself, it will play a huge role in our energy security over the decades to come. And because fracking is a way to get at it that seems to matter in a fairly significant sense, I think it's a part of our future. The challenge, as with any energy extraction activity, is to try to ensure that it's done in a thoughtful and responsible and safe way. And there are both kind of traditional environmental questions that surround the practice, things like what you do with the produced water, fugitive emissions at the compressor stations, these kinds of things. These are eminently manageable types of concerns, I think. We deal with them in other settings and have been for a long time. But there are also some non-traditional issues, including the issue of methane infiltration, of drinking water supplies, what that really is about, questions about how you ensure that well design is sufficiently secure to eliminate that possibility. There's a study that's being done by the Office of Research and Development at EPA on the environmental implications of fracking that has a, I think, late 2013 horizon to it. It'll be interesting to see how that study comes out. I'm guessing it'll say that this is a practice that can be done safely, but there need to be some additional measures put in place. And the one other non-traditional consideration here, and this is something I know that ELI is working on, what are the community level implications of these practices? We're going to see, how do you avoid a boom and bust kind of scenario that leads to non-sustainable communities, so we don't end up with fracking ghost towns in these places where there's a tremendous amount of activity in a short period of time that over time diminishes or is done altogether.
Bill, natural gas, fracking?
Well, I think Sudine and Scott both identified the environmental issues pretty well. I would just add a perspective. I think there's a difference of views among the various organizations in the environmental community. There's some who are basically opposed to almost everything, so there's going to be some pushback. But I think the folk who've been working in this pretty thoughtfully believe that this is an energy, a fuel of the future, current, and it's going to be for the future, and it's something we're going to need to learn to deal with effectively. There's clearly a lack of overall regulation. It's inconsistent in different places, and I think if we could spend time working through that, we would solve a lot of problems. I think the best practices are possible to mitigate some of the obvious downsides to hydraulic fracturing, but the industry itself doesn't seem to want to take that on and keeps pushing that off, and I think that's the point of tension within the environmental community. I'll come back to a point I made earlier, is that I think in almost every energy development opportunity, we need to be thinking about planning rather than responding, and the idea of SMART from the start is let's make the choices about where and how and who and when up front, and not just wait until we smell gas and start giving permits out. It's just, there's a different paradigm now that I think we have an opportunity to put in place, and this is a time to do that with hydraulic fracturing. I would point to an article, I'm not certain when this op-ed appeared in the Washington Post, probably 9 months ago, but it was Mayor Bloomberg and John Mitchell, who is one of the early perfecters, really, of hydraulic fracturing, really making the claim that this is an important fuel. It can be done well, it can be done safely or relatively safely, but it has to be regulated, and there are bad actors in the mix that need to be weeded out, and the best actors, the good actors, using best management practices in the right places, can make this a really important energy for the future.
And we didn't mention the greenhouse gas dividend as well. I mean, that's another reason that it really needs
if you
to be
manage the
part of
methane emissions.
Right, the fugitives.
Right. So I think that's right.
I will point out that talking to some of the natural gas people, we've actually learned that they say one of the continual complaints we have right now is trucks. It just turns out it requires a lot of truck traffic, and you tend to do that late at night. And these are heavy trucks that actually, after a period of time, destroy the roads. And they've said to us that we have to actually bring that under control. I have a question from the audience. I'm going to read it, but I'm actually going to ask it a little bit broader. Here's the question, but then I'm going to make it broader to Congress, and that is, any thoughts on how the House and Senate will address a new Water Resources Development Act, WRDA? Both have committed to respecting the earmark ban while not ceding authority to the administration. Is this even possible? All right, that's the narrow question. I'm going to broaden it. And the broaden is, so with their Congress. We started out, most of us, talking about the upcoming economic cliff. I find myself traveling internationally now more, and you routinely get a question that says, what exactly is happening in the United States? And I realize most often I really can't answer that, because my answer would be something like, well, we didn't have to do it, and then we did something that we never wanted to act on, but now we've never been able to solve it, so bad things are going to happen. And I realize that's not much of an answer. And so we have, Congress. There's other things, climate issues. Bill, some of the things you mentioned, and conservation, TSCA reform, renewable standards, all those things. So starting again with Bill, and we'll just move down. Any hope for Congress?
No. I mean, I think you can't. It's hard to get a hearing on any issue, much less a decision. So, and to get a decision that both the House and the Senate would accept is, I think, impossible. And if the administration weighs in, it means the House is going to be in opposition. So, it's really, really hard to see any congressional action that has, well, I mean, candidly, any positive or negative impact on the environment. So.
Well, there's no cause for optimism, that's for sure. It may be that there are some opportunities for incremental improvement. I think, for example, of the fact that we're at the concluding stage of this Mercury Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
There will need to be, I think, some modest legislation, implementing legislation that would be necessary for ratification of that. It's not a terribly controversial treaty, I don't believe, given how it's developed. So maybe there's an opportunity to work on something that everyone can agree to there that would lead incrementally in the direction of a greater degree of collaboration. I also wonder whether TSCA reform, because it's important among others to the chemical industry in the United States, whether there's an opportunity to sort of congeal around that as an idea that would be a little less challenging than something like the climate and energy legislation that we most desperately need. It's hard to imagine that being able to happen, and I think the president was a little bit fatalistic about it in his State of the Union address when he talked about use of executive authority, however far that can carry, in the event that Congress doesn't act, and I don't expect that they will.
But Sadine, how about in your area? Senators Wyden and Murkowski have been famously traveling together. Their staff are talking about that committee being an oasis of competency. Is there any hope now, just because of that relationship, that we'll see things out of that committee?
Well, I think seeing them travel together is very interesting, because with Senator Bingaman retiring, he had been an across-the-aisle kind of person, and the question that was being asked, would Senator Wyden follow in his footsteps? And I think the answer is yes. He is reaching across the aisle. Is anything going to happen? One other interesting development is on Senator Murkowski's side. Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska, is the ranking member of the Senate Energy Committee. And she, a couple of weeks ago, put out a discussion paper around energy policy, asked the public to reconsider how they looked at energy policy, and with the natural gas industry changes, think about energy as abundant, not constrained, as we have previously thought about energy in the U.S. And what's interesting to me about her policy statement, her policy paper, is that it's very broad. I think she's learned a lot from having been in the Senate Energy Committee, on the Senate Energy Committee. If you ever want to get energy legislation, you have to make it broad, because we have so many different sectors of the energy industry and so many different regions. Energy tends not to be a partisan issue. It's more a regional issue. So if you want to achieve a consensus piece of legislation, you better give something to everybody. And her policy statement does. Whether we could ever agree on it, I don't really think so. But maybe we'll have little morsels. If we bring everybody to the table, which her policy statement does, maybe we'll have little morsels here and there. Perhaps we'll see some advances when we talk about tax reform. That's been a continuing issue, how we provide for tax credits for renewables industry, and different business structures like master limited partnerships for gas and oil infrastructure industry, and could we come up with a more coherent approach to energy tax issues? I am going to walk out on the plank and say do think we'll see cybersecurity legislation at some point. That's not necessarily energy legislation. It's broader than that, but I think we'll see something.
Can I add 2 points?
Sure.
First, related to Senator Murkowski, I find it curious that we are talking about the abundance of energy, and at the same time, she continues to lead the drumbeat to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is an iconic place for the conservation world. So, I think there'll continue to be a debate, and I don't see much change in that. I actually don't think anything will happen, but it's going to require a lot of attention. I think the second, there is a very small sliver of opportunity within the conservation world because in Congress, around wilderness legislation. This is very local. And there are a number of Republican House members who are actually supporting, have introduced, or will introduced in the last Congress, wilderness legislation for their own districts or their own communities. And I think there is some chance that with enough Republican support that the committee headed by Doc Hastings will in fact come to the table around an omnibus public lands bill. It will be small, it will not be bold, there will not be anywhere near the kind of titles that were included in the 2009 omnibus, but I think there's a possibility that it could happen.
I'm going to take questions from the audience, but I do want to, the question on WRDA, which is the Water Resources Development Act. House and Senate will clearly be serious about that. And my prediction is they will have earmarks, but they won't call them earmarks. They will define it differently because that's the only way that bill ever comes through. Please.
I agree on WRDA, particularly a bipartisan agreement between Boxer and Bitter. And they've got this idea in Title V of the draft bill to do watershed projects in at least 2 states.
So for the audience, or where we had a comment agreeing and also indicating, which has been reported, an agreement between Senator Vitters, who's now the ranking minority on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Boxer, who's the ranking majority, that they would actually spread the wealth among states, which makes it more likely to pass.
As far
Others?
as possible. As far as possible. I have a question for
Please.
Sudine and Scott. Does FERC...
And I need to repeat the question for the people in the, so you go ahead and state it, and then I'll repeat it so that the people that are listening to us can hear it.
Okay. Does FERC or EPA have the authority to set effluent limits for discharge of fracking fluids to groundwater or surface water?
So the question is authority by relevant agencies to regulate fracking fluid.
Yeah, FERC or EPA.
FERC does not have any explicit authority, and I'm just trying to think creatively of whether there's anything in the Natural Gas Act that might arguably be used, and I don't think so. FERC has jurisdiction over pipelines, but not production. So unless there could be some linkage of those fluids to pipelines, I don't...
Comes out of a pipe.
Scott?
Well, I think, water aficionados who hear this response, feel free to correct me, but there are limitations, as you know, under the Safe Drinking Water Act relating to fracking activity. But I don't see any reason why, if we're dealing with a point source discharge, that it's not possible to construct an effluent limitation guideline that would apply to this practice. I don't know that there's such a thing under development, but it strikes me as being within the reach of the agency's authority.
I agree with both comments, and I've also pointed out, as many of you know, there's a number of states who have already done it, a number of states who already have disclosure requirements and so forth for dispersants, and that is where things are happening right now in hydraulic fracturing, is in the states. Other questions from our audience, please?
You have a second question?
No, you only get one right now. Go ahead.
Oh. All over the world, cities are expanding and are projected to expand rapidly at the expense of wilderness in the future, everywhere on the globe. And when I worked in China, in Western China, of course that's going on there, but every high building, even some low buildings in Southwest China, have solar panels on the roof for hot water especially. And China's going gung-ho in the development of solar panels. So I want to know, quite apart from Congress, what's happening to encourage the development of solar energy, and particularly urban solar panels in the United States.
Okay, for those of you who are listening, and we'll go to Sudine first, the question is really the promotion and development of solar energy. An example is buildings in China where, in fact, there are local solar, and of course, China is now pretty much pushing the entire market on solar. But Sudine?
Solar panels are more popular in states where there is an active tax credit structure in place. In fact, New Jersey is one of the leading solar production states. You don't think of New Jersey as the Sunshine State, but because of their incentives, they actually have quite a bit of solar production. I think we're going to see more solar production coming out of natural disasters where the transmission system has been disrupted, like Hurricane Sandy, where the concern is around whether the existing transmission structure really leads to reliability or whether we should have microgrids. If we have microgrids, then we open up a market for distributed generation like solar panels. Apart from that, the bigger markets are in developing countries because in those developing countries, they're working from a shortage situation. In the U.S., we by and large have enough electricity. So it's difficult for the electric utilities to move from the paying for the existing generation to distributed generation. That's not in their interest. But in developing countries where there isn't enough electricity, that's where we're seeing not only solar panels, but also energy efficiency being incorporated at the outset, smart grid, and smart electricity infrastructure development. It's easier to accomplish there.
I'm going to take another question, but this reminds me, as we talk about solar, another current event for 2013 was the extension of the production tax credit for wind. And one actually important part of that extension is it now takes effect when you start the project, as opposed to when you finish the project. And as you can see, that will have a bigger impact this year. And so we're predicting way more wind starts just because of the extension of the production tax credit and that change. Next question, please, right there.
I've seen several executive orders and other presidential documents about streamlining the review process for energy infrastructure projects, especially NEPA and ESA. And I wonder if anyone cares to comment about whether those are having any real impact on the review process for these types of projects, or if they're just merely aspirational.
All right, so we have for the audience on the phone, we have the question is about executive orders that are emphasizing streamlining issues, and the examples were NEPA and ESA. There's probably other examples of there, and whether or not that is having an effect. And Scott, I'll turn to you and see.
I don't think that they're ineffective, but I think their primary function is as an accelerator as opposed to sort of clearing out issues. It does encourage the process to move forward at a faster clip, but the issues that may emerge within the context of interagency review are going to be the same issues, and some of them are quite difficult to sort out. So I don't think it's without influence, but I think its promise is probably primarily in the timing of decisions as opposed to the substantive outcome.
You know, I think there is, I think it's too early to tell. I think this is one of these issues where it's set up and we have to prove that it can work. But I think with the solar programmatic EIS, at least in the zoning, it opens, I think, 285,000 acres in the 6 western states for development with the understanding that the process will be streamlined because a lot of the work has been done, will be done beforehand. To clear, it has already been done, so it clears those 285,000 acres for development. And then there's a variance process that will have to be proven out that adds another, I think, 19 million acres to the availability. And then in balance, there's 62 million acres that are actually non-production that add to the conservation values. And so the conservation community is really interested in this process, and it's done in some ways to avoid the litigation that comes from organizations like ours, where you have, it's really hard for a developer to get beyond the litigation piece. But if you can make some of those decisions up front, you minimize the litigation. So, I'm hopeful that we'll actually get good conservation gains and also get a streamlined process for energy development and investment.
So, Dean, I have a question from our listening audience from Nature Served in Boulder, Colorado. Here it is. It seems that the way our government is set up, there is too much focus on immediate needs and not much or any focus on creating a sustainable future. How can we move toward a stronger renewable energy framework? That's the question. Even if energy is abundant now, we know that our energy supplies are limited long term. And we know that renewable energy has less environmental and health impacts for species and pollution. So long-term issues.
I think the question posed by the listener is quite appropriate and correctly observes that to the extent market forces are driving our decisions, it's going to be short-term, pretty short-term. So with the price of natural gas low, we're going to be building natural gas-fired generation if we just leave the decision to the marketplace. So there's a significant role here for regulation. And right now, that's regulation at the state level, because I don't think Congress is going to take the lead with something like a national renewable portfolio standard. And there are many states, I believe that something like 35, that have renewable portfolio standards in place. California's is the most aggressive with a 33% mandate. Talk is that the governor is soon going to ask that be pushed to 40%. And not surprisingly, that's where we're seeing renewable growth. And in order to move long-term into renewables, particularly today, we need that. We need those kinds of policies because, absent that, as I mentioned, natural gas is cheaper. And also because right at the moment, there's very little electricity demand. So unless we have something else spurring generation, we're just not going to have new generation. So state renewable portfolio standards that are aggressive and that are enforced will do it. EPA regulations making it more difficult and more expensive for coal-fired generation to exist is also indirectly having an impact on renewable growth, because as those aging plants face increased costs, they're going to retire. And then we have a pocket of demand for new generation that renewables could fill.
So on renewable, this is my follow-up. So renewable energy standards is another area which, of course, there could be federal legislation. Senator Bingaman was famously for it. A member of the ELI board, Senator Mark Udall of Colorado, was very clear in supporting it, and Colorado has its own. Is that a possibility because of the enormous consensus in states for that standard that there could be a federal standard?
Well, it certainly was a possibility in 2009. Although, because, as you mentioned, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee not only drafted legislation, but the committee passed it. So there was a bipartisan support for a national renewable policy standard. Today, I'm not so sure.
Scott, I have a question from you from our listening audience, and you'll feel good. This comes from someone from GAO. How can EPA push down further on states given the budget climate? Haven't states resisted efficiency measures such as electronic reporting requirements? So this is federalism, cooperative federalism at its best, Scott.
No, I think it is true that the states, some states at least, have resisted the move towards electronic reporting. But I think that some of that is just sort of the natural resistance to change. I think there's a barrier that we just have to kind of break through and move into the modern era where there's greater access to information, transparency, and I think that we'll see dividends that flow from that. That'll actually reduce the state's burdens over time. A lot of time is spent in crunching numbers and trying to make sure that the data is accurate. If it's up and online, it has a way of getting accurate, and there are forces that come into play that inspire accuracy at the first in the first instance. Yeah, I mean, the states are overburdened. There's no question about that. I mean, they're in a very difficult spot. On one hand, they're dealing with, I'm sure, what seems to them as an unending cascade of additional responsibilities and requirements. On the other, they're seeing their own budgets being diminished, and the federal contribution to their budgets likewise being diminished. It's a tough spot to be in. But I think that this is the kind of moment that really just requires a collaborative exercise in creativity to figure out not necessarily what we might do that we thought about before, but in view of where we are at this moment in time, how can we make this work better? How can the relationship work better? How can we reduce the state's burdens, not increase them because we're sloughing more of our work off onto the states? And I think that's a challenge, and I think there's some opportunity, largely presented by technology and where we are in the information age.
There's a question over here, please.
To play devil's advocate for just a moment in response to Scott's point about the states, have we not reached a point in time where cooperative federalism and the underpinnings of the environmental laws have been turned on their head? That there's gridlock in Washington and legislation can't be enacted. There's no money really in any major way that can support programs. And so don't the states really become laboratories for change because they are not so longer and so much bridled by federal oversight?
So the question now is basically, is cooperative federalism dead? We have this great thesis of environmental law and policy, of federal-state interaction, and just because of where we are right now, I want to make a comment myself, and then I'm going to turn to Bill Meadows and then see if anybody else has it. Let's see, I guess it was right my first 6 months as president of ELI, I got invited by the Texas Super Conference to go down and debate the Texas Attorney General on cooperative federalism. It is certainly true that my opponent did not agree with any of the terms, particularly the cooperative part about it all. But I would say at the end of our debate, I said, if you look at our laws as they exist today, and there really hasn't been any much change in environmental laws since the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, there's a built-up need to update, to change, to improve. And I'm not talking about massive reauthorization. I'm talking about targeted issues. And I turned to it was the Deputy Attorney General who stood in, and I said, I bet over a long weekend we could agree to 10 things. Despite the fact we're on opposite sides of this issue, 10 things that would be good government. And he said, I agree. We probably could do that. But Bill, what about the state-federal stuff? If the states as laboratories, where do you sit on that?
Well, I'd like to jump over the states and actually think more about local communities, because I do think this is where the opportunities lie, and it certainly is true in land conservation. I think the emphasis for many organizations now is to look at large landscape conservation as a place where solutions can occur. You're dealing with public land from the state and federal level, private land, tribal lands. If the landscape is large enough, you can find a place for everyone, and you can come to agreement on where conservation is necessary. And you can do that by engaging stakeholders. I think there needs to be political leadership in that process, and frequently it will come from a member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, who wants a solution, who sees the conflict and sees an opportunity. The worst example I can see at the state level is in Utah, with the state legislature voted to review any federal policy that has to do with public land. I mean, it's kind of a nullification theory. It's and so you're having to deal with that at some level. But even there, at the local level, there's a willingness to talk with conservation organizations and try to find solutions. So.
I'm actually surprised at this audience, a very distinguished audience, that nobody has asked Scott Fulton how he could have approved all those job-killing Clean Air Act regulations during his time period. And do you see the administration going that way in the future? What's happening, Scott? This is
I
unrehearsed.
think we may have a disagreement about terms also. Regulation is inescapably a part of the agency's past and its future. As long as our laws are continue to operate the way that they're framed now, there are things that EPA will have to do. So when we think about the Clean Air Act, some things to have in view are probably first and foremost what the agency will do with the greenhouse gas emissions regulation. Particularly in view of the President's statement and the State of the Union address. And the thing to watch most particularly there, besides the Supreme Court potential on the rules that are already in place, is the new source performance standards under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, and what the agency will do with its proposed standard that's out now that would cover new sources in the pure sense. But in some ways, more importantly, what it will do with the program that's envisioned under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act, which is like a state implementation plan program for existing sources, where you take the new source articulation and try to make sense of it in the existing source context. I think a lot of folks think that's where the real action is, in part because of the economic dynamics that Sudine was talking about. We don't really expect a lot of new sources to be coal-fired power plants. So the real action is how you think about the existing fleet, which includes a lot of coal-fired power, and how you can construct a regime through regulation that might achieve some of the benefits that folks had hoped might come out of a climate bill. So that really bears watching. I'm sure it'll be a priority and the focus of some attention. Lots of other.
Who's in charge of the climate legislation within the White House?
Who's in charge of it within the White House?
Probably Heather Zeichel.
This is the last question. That was who's in the White House, but actually after Carol Browner left, then Heather Zeichel was in charge. We're coming to a close. Some of it will stay afterwards outside of this room, but if we join all of us in saying a lot of amazing things happening, a lot of challenges, but we're all happy to be doing the things that we're doing right now. We want to be here. We want to be part of what's going to be discussed, what's going to be looked at. These are challenging times, but they're also opportunistic times, and we need to be riding that, and we're thankful that you're here listening about energy, environment, and natural resources, and we turn you back over to